Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank, part two. Greg, thanks for doing my show. If you want to let everyone know a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself to everybody.
Yeah, hello. Thanks for having me. My name's Greg Caruso. I am professor of philosophy at SUNY Corning, honorary professor of philosophy at Macquarie University. I work mainly on issues having to do with free will, moral responsibility, criminal punishment, criminal justice, a bunch of topics that surround human agency and responsibility, whether legal responsibility or moral responsibility. And I've written a number of books on topics related to free will and criminal justice and punishment.
Now, the topic of free will. What is your stance on free will? Because I know a lot of people say I can do whatever I want. I'll do whatever I want when I want. But I feel like there's a lot more other factors, I would say, when it comes into decision making or just basis of what people would identify as free will. We all like to think that we're free, but I consider that we're not really. Like we can't just walk out naked in like public. That's a crime. But a lot of our choices, especially nowadays, depending on who you are, maybe for me, for instance, I base a lot of my decisions on the things that I do on what would be seen as morally right. Like obviously I'm not going to spit on a puppy. I'm not going to do any of that type of stuff. But in the capacity you are, I wouldn't say free to do so. Society might reject you as such, but I feel like a lot of my decisions boil down to what society will think or what other people will think rather than what I personally believe.
Right. So you're pointing to reasons for why you do what you do, and those reasons might be shaped by factors beyond your control, like cultural norms, societal expectations, understanding of, and um, in sort of cultural construction of moral values. So I'm a free will skeptic. I maintain that who we are and what we do is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control. We could talk about what those factors might be. And because of this, we're never morally responsible in a very particular kind of sense. This is the sense that would make an individual truly deserving of praise and blame, punishment and reward. So maybe I should just start by saying what I mean by free will. So for me, free will is a kind of control and action. It's a kind of control that agents would need to have for us to treat them in certain kind of ways with certain kinds of reactive attitudes, things like moral anger, retributive punishment. Um, we treat them in these ways because we believe they deserve it, and they deserve it in a kind of basic sense. Like, so if you did some criminal acts, you did it freely, you are morally responsible for that act, and you justly deserve to be punished for that act. I reject this kind of free will because I think agents are the result of factors beyond their control, which include things like how they were raised, the cultural factors that might influence them, early childhood experiences, genetics, brain chemistry, the whole host of things that play into our choices, such that you might think agents aren't ultimately responsible for becoming the kind of people they are. And so this is a longstanding, obviously, philosophical debate. And it's one of the oldest philosophical debates, by the way. I mean, more has been written about the topic of free will than probably any other issue in philosophy, including God's existence.
Why do you think there's such a questionable bound with free will? Like, do you just feel like people just don't really understand what the capacity that is? Like, I mean, even if we talk about environmental influences, which I would consider probably one of a leading factor to the way that maybe people work, or at least a factor that shapes development. And I think your development is your choices, or not even just your choices, just a construct of someone's being and character. And I don't think we really truly want to extend that to understanding someone else. That might have came out wrong, more on an aspect of like we really only know what we know and our experience, and we try and relate that to a lot of people don't try and understand another person's experience. So we base a lot of our decisions, a lot of what's okay, not okay, on the basis of, well, I wouldn't do that, so why would they do that? And then it's just unthinkable. So it seems like they need to be rejected in a sense.
That might be an underlying reason why we sort of have this belief, but there's many reasons I think people have historically believed in free will. One of them is it seems to play an important role, as you say, in our interpersonal relationships with others. I mean, when someone else does a harmful act or wrongs you in some intimate way, we tend to want to blame them. And we can only really justify blaming them if we think that they're somehow free and responsible for what they did. And so this sort of tendency to hold individuals responsible presupposes that they have a kind of free will. And so we may fear the consequences of giving up the belief in free will because we fear we'd have to give up that account of responsibility. The other aspect, I think, is a first person type of experience. Now, you're suggesting you feel that your choices are the result of these other constraints, but lots of people feel that their actions are undetermined, that it's ultimately up to them, that they could have done otherwise. And this leads them to believe that their actions are free because when they look within themselves, when they reflect on their own actions, that process of deliberation, choice, and action seems like have some kind of ultimate control, that it's ultimately up to them. So, like, let's say, you chose to put on that shirt today. Many people feel like they could have done otherwise. They could have chosen something else. They could have picked a different outfit. Or what you ate for breakfast. Well, what you chose is based on, your available options, but maybe you have a few things to choose from. You feel as if whatever it was that you decided to eat, the Frosty Flakes or whatever, that you could have chosen something else, the Cheerios. Um, and then the question is whether or not that feeling is ultimately real or some kind of an illusion.
It's advertising. Advertising pushes me towards the Frosted Flakes. It's that brainwash program. It's like when we see that those jingle commercials on or something like that. They have a catchy little jingle that just gets you hooked. Sticks in your brain.
So this is already a reason to start thinking that although I make the choice, so I don't deny individuals make choices. The question is whether or not the reasons why they choose what they do are ultimately, again, determined by factors beyond their control. So let's say, as you point out, I choose the Frosty Flakes and I choose them because I prefer them. The question of whether or not that preference was itself, sort of self-made or was the result of factors beyond your control, may be relevant to the question of whether or not you're free. And so, as you're pointing out, advertising plays a big role in shaping our preferences. Personal exposure to what you ate as a child may play a role in determining your choices. Maybe they're hereditary or genetic factors. Most definitely environmental and cultural factors. Like if you're raised in Japan or the Middle East or in ancient Greece, you might have a different taste profile. You might prefer different types of cultural foods. You may, prefer fish-based diets because that's what's available or that's what you're accustomed to. So part of who we are is shaped by these factors, and our decisions are a byproduct partly of who we are. So the question is ultimately, do we have the kind of control and action over any of these factors, i.e., who we are as individuals or the choices that are the byproducts of who we are? Are these the kind of choices that agents should be held accountable for? And again, a very specific sense. I don't deny individuals um, have a certain kind of responsibility. What I deny in just particular is that they have the kind of what I call basic desert responsibility, which is the kind that's relevant to retributive punishment, the kind that would need to be that would agents would have to be justly held accountable in the sense of angry blame or resentment or indignation.
Well, what do you think about like on a more serious issue? Like, would this come into play? Like, I already start thinking about environmental factors. I'm thinking about criminal factors. Like, you can't just like in the topic of like if someone shoots another person, that was that person's decision to do so. But also, I know that an environmental factor might come into play. A person, how they're raised, or something like that, plays into a factor. But that that's a sketchy line to be drawn because then if you put those factors in, that person gets off and then it just perpetuates more, doesn't it? It would just make more people that might be doing shootings. Maybe I'm drawing a long example, but even with environmental things, for instance, there's a lot of people that have been told that the world's going to end by 2100, the oceans are going to flood. All of these talkings, I mean, even with paleontologists, geologists, whoever you want to say, that say it might not be that extreme, it still brainwashes a bunch of people to start fighting online and fighting on social media, where it starts questioning even other things. I mean, I think most of the decisions I do in my life are probably brainwashed into me from something. I mean, whether it's doing a podcast, I've done so many of them. Maybe I'm just on a routine basis. Then it brings up the routine. How many people's routines you can take a left in your car while you're driving down the highway just randomly, all because you want to. In that moment, you're like, I want to decide I'm going to take a left. Is that just because you're tired of living the same routine, structured life all and over again? You want to seem like you have a little bit of resemblance of power into your life? But I mean, there's a lot of people that make decisions, everything just subliminally from scrolling through social media. I mean, that's the thing, is like, I feel like a lot of like the anger, a lot of the tension, a lot of the problems, a lot of the issues boil down to factors of how you've kind of set your life up. I don't necessarily think anybody's life is really necessarily structured, but I also don't think it's necessarily free. I think it's as free as you want it to be. And I feel like people will push boundaries depending on where that goes. I think the idea, if you start wondering if you're slowly being brainwashed by everything, can make you go insane. But also, I think that is an illusion in itself as well, too.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things there to to kind of follow up on. I mean, one, I think it's important to distinguish different concepts of freedom here. I mean, political freedom might be distinct from the kind of freedom we're talking about with free will. So you're right. There are people in certain circumstances where politically they may not have the full set of options. They may be constrained in their choices. Um, but even within that small range, that small realm of political freedom, people still tend to think they have free will. And your example of veering right or left or whichever one you said, I can't remember, um, is that even in just small choices, one might still think they have the freedom, even if the freedom to pick up this pen or not pick up this pen, or to turn left or right, even if there are political constraints on their liberty. So I would deny that they do have that kind of free will in, again, a fundamental sense. So I would focus on why what's the reason you choose to veer left just arbitrarily. You say there's for no reason, but I would argue there's always some kind of reason. So for example, I ask my students, can you believe anything you want? And some of them say, yes, of course I can. And then you hit them with obvious examples where they can't. Like, you can't believe right now if you walk out of the window of a 10-story building, you won't fall to the ground. And I don't mean fake it or feign it or pretend to believe it, but really believe it. Be in a psychological state of actually actively believing this to be true. And the reason you can is all your life's experiences have kind of mounted, and use a very strong word here, sort of condition you to believe in gravity. So every one of our life's experiences has kind of confirmed that bodies of mass left unsupported, like if I drop this pen, it's going to fall to the ground. And we get those experiences from the first time we're a child and we push the Cheerio off the high chair and it disappears. And so, because of those repeated experiences, we've acquired this kind of belief. Now, let's say I say this, and sometimes this comes up. I say to someone, "You can't just freely believe that," and then they decide they want to prove me wrong, and then, like, let's say they want to walk out the window. Never had a student walk out the window, but let's say they do that. That doesn't prove free will. That proves that you're defiant, you have trouble with authority, you have a desire to prove the professor wrong. And then my question would be, where did that desire come from? Where did that tendency of being, resistant to authority, or when someone tells you you can't do something, show them that you can. In this case, they're not actually believing that they can levitate. What they're willing to do is break their leg to prove my point wrong. And then the question will be, how did that come about? What kind of person is that? How did that personality develop over time? And you could probably go find explanations in their childhood and their previous experiences with how they were raised, what kind of experiences they've had with authority in the past. Um, and so once you start thinking about it, as you suggest, we're constantly bombarded with the internet, with information, with advertising. corporations are trying to hack our brains all the time and try to get us to desire various things or prefer various things, and they're very good at that. Um, Now, within that, some people still think they have a certain modicum of free will. But what I would suggest is we got to get clear on what that freedom is and how it would work, and then you have to get a kind of clearer sense of what they mean by this freedom. And philosophers have different conceptions of free will that they might appeal to. Ones that suggest that they have to be undetermined, that they have to have some kind of fundamental, what's called libertarian free will to be held accountable. And then there are those that think you can preserve a relevant kind of free will, even if our actions are determined, as long as the agent acts in accordance with their desires, with their preferences, that's enough. And I have arguments against both of those kind of views, but they're different types of arguments.
I kind of like the Carl Sagan idea, which is like you have to be open-minded to a point, but not so open-minded that your brain falls out of your head. I feel like you can be as free. I would like people to be as free as they want. I probably side more with a libertarian than anything, but I feel like you have to be as free as you want, but you also need order as well too. Like I don't believe in tearing down the government. I think the government's needed in a lot of aspects as well too. But you never find like that middle roader. And if you were a middle roader, you would be the type of person that would be like, well, just pick a damn side. And it was like, well, maybe I don't want to. Maybe I want to ask the questions and bring kind of like people even say devil's advocate. I don't really necessarily think it's devil's advocate. I think it's just kind of bringing both sides of the conversation to the table. Like I really like that aspect of things.
Yeah, I mean, I would say a couple of things. There's two different notions of libertarianism here that philosophers, I mean, there's the political notion, which I think you're using, of minimal government. There's a metaphysical notion of libertarianism, though, that thinks that agents are free in a sense that they're not causally determined. So one of the big threats to free will historically was this notion of determinism. And determinism is a thesis that facts about the remote past in conjunction with the laws of nature entail there's only one fixed future. And this was a view that comes out of classical physics, of the physics of Newton and Maxwell and Einstein, that suggests the universe is deterministic and everything in it is deterministic. Now, this has been thrown into some doubt with quantum mechanics at a very fundamental level. Maybe things are not determined. Um, but if determinism is true, can agents be free? And the libertarian, not the political libertarian, but this kind of metaphysical libertarian view, is that no, if determinism is true, there's no free will. So that so what they have to make sense of is a notion of agency, um, that preserves some freedom where the kinds of laws of nature maybe don't apply fully to human behavior, or or that somehow quantum indeterminacies can exist at a level that is relevant to human behavior, because otherwise everything we do seems to be determined from prior antecedent events. And so that kind of libertarian free will is very hard to defend in a way because it's hard to fit into our scientific worldview. um, I would also argue it's hard to defend because quantum indeterminacies seem no more within the control of agents than determinism would be within the control of agents. So introducing some randomness into the order isn't necessarily going to get you the kind of free will agents tend to think they have as well.
I've spoken to a couple of quantum theorists that believe that like everything's predetermined already. So like every single move you make was already a move that was already designed, and it's on this complex pattern of movements that are leading to an inevitable end or something like that. And I'm like, that sounds like the most boring way to live your life. Like thinking that every move, like me, every single word that I'm saying is a predetermined thing rather than just a flow of thought. Like, I don't know how people could live like that necessarily. I like the aspect that even if that is a possibility that that could be with, which I don't really side with, I still like the objectivity that I'm still kind of being able to sporadically make my own decisions in a sense as well, too.
Yeah, well, there's a question about whether or not what we want to be true is true or not. And so I think you're right. I mean, most people don't want to think that everything they do is determined in a way. But I also think you can't really, as you point out, you can't really live your life as if everything is fated to happen. Now, I'm not, fatalism is different than determinism. Fatalism for me is a kind of notion of resignation. You just give up, right? Because everything's fated to happen. Nothing I do is ever going to change that. That's not what the free will skeptic is saying. I mean, fatalism is like, JFK was destined to die on that particular day, no matter what he did. No, I mean, for the determinist, what you choose is going to be relevant. Like if you determine, if you choose to jump in front of the train and say, if I'm fated to die today, I will, and if I'm not, I won't. That's a poor decision to make, because the decision to jump in front of the train is going to determine that you die. The question is more about, is the decision in the process of what you're deciding when you decide it, the result of factors that you may not be at that moment aware of, right? And many times, as you point out, like the kinds of things that cause us to have the beliefs we have are not in my consciousness when I'm making the choice. I'm just aware that I believe certain things and have certain moral principles and have certain kinds of attitudes or political views on things. And I'm making my choices based on those kind of conscious reasons. But the reason you have those beliefs or those desires or those political views themselves have been shaped over time by experience, how you were raised, who your parents were, what other kind of influences may have affected you, the kind of person that you are, what kind of habitual character, your psychological likes and dislikes and preferences. And so if everything you do is the byproduct of those internal psychological motivational states, but you don't ultimately control those motivational states, then the argument would be you don't ultimately control the outcome.
Do you think that like the ingrained traits or the traits that someone has developed over time necessarily are probably the factors that are the reason why they actually don't have free will?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's complicated, right? So there are certain things that I think we acknowledge, we have little to no control over, like whether you're born with a learning defect or a certain type of genetic disorder. We all acknowledge we have no control over that. We sometimes acknowledge we have no control over certain types of personality traits, and some of that might be hereditary or genetic. Um, and then it starts getting harder. We tend to think we have more control over other aspects of who we are. But then the argument against those would be to. So let me give you an example. Let me just use some, like, let's say this is a toy example, but let's say I believe there's chocolate in the kitchen. I desire chocolate. And so I choose to get up and get the chocolate. And I realize, like, I'm eating chocolate all the time and this is not good. And so one day I just decide to join Chocoholics Anonymous. And I go to these Chocoholics meetings. I learn how to control my cravings, and now I don't eat as much chocolate. You might think this is the result of free will, but I would argue focus on the decision. Now, this is a hard one, but where did the desire to stop desiring chocolate come from? The desire that maybe led you to go join Chocoholics Anonymous.
It's
Was that
because you were thinking that you're going to get fat, and that's why you decided to join Chocoholics Anonymous.
right? Like maybe my wife said something about my weight. Maybe my doctor said something about my cholesterol. Maybe I read something in a newspaper. Maybe someone yelled something about my size out of a window as they drove by. And those various experiences are now new causes that are shaping my desire to stop desiring chocolate. And so I take some active steps to, retrain myself, right? So you have that kind of control, I would argue. But that kind of control is not enough for free will, because the cause for you to take these steps to recondition yourself were themselves caused by things you don't control.
Dude, when we were talking about before, I was like, how could anybody have like an issue with like a debate on what free will is? And then you get into the details of it. It's like, oh my God, wait, this is a complex topic.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, is it a topic that you would think would ever want to be settled? Like that's the thing is like when you start really discussing it, like I mean, the conversation is definitely interesting. It's one that I would just want to keep on going on and going on and going on with because there's so many points that you could bring up from all different aspects of why a person does what they do. There's not one narrative definitive thing of like, yeah, I'm free. It's like, well, what's that part into it? I believe that much like I said earlier about environmental influences, but also just so many factors, trauma induced characteristics of why you want to choose a certain thing. I don't think it just boils down to like, you can't just be like, I have free will, so I'm going to be 7 feet tall. It doesn't work like that. But I also think that your factors when it comes to, oh man, anything. I mean, how many people are just repeating things that are just on social media, for instance? Let's bring it to that. The biggest example is in front of all of our faces. Half the time someone makes a decision on something, you don't even know if it's advertisement that's programmed you to think this type of way as well, too, which makes you kind of question like, am I thinking what I'm thinking, or is it just something like religion? Let's take religion for instance, Christianity. How many people have the free will to be like, oh, I'm a Christian but I have free will? It's like, okay, well, was your family Christian? Yeah. Did you guys go to church every Sunday? Yeah. You don't think that plays an effect on why you're religious?
Right.
Yeah.
No, right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, and those are clear examples. Like the kind of religions you're born into are usually the religions that are the ones that your parents had, and then you acquire those, and you could react to them, you could reject them, and there might be reasons for you to diverge from your parents, but those reasons would be probably that you've experienced other people and you've had other kinds of influences that have become more salient on you than the ones that are coming from your parents, right? Um, but if you think about, you mentioned criminal behavior before, and in a way, it's actually kind of easier to see there. I mean, one of the things I've done in my own work is look a lot at criminal behavior and what drives it. And one of the arguments I've made is that criminal behavior is often more a byproduct of circumstance than people. And when you look at the causes of criminal behavior, what I call the social determinants of criminal behavior, what you'll find is that there are some really amazing and somewhat crazy and startling correlations between poverty and incarceration and low socioeconomic status and crime and abuse and domestic violence and housing and mental illness and healthcare and education and nutrition. And such that when you begin to look at it, you think that, especially when you're looking at it at a statistical level, on a kind of macro level, you start to think that it's less about individual choice and individual people deciding freely to do bad things. You tend to see that it's a byproduct of social context and social constructs and social injustices and social systems. Um, so if you want to prevent crime, one of the best ways to do it is kind of structure society in a way that you address these social determinants. So here's one example that I think is kind of overwhelming just because of the statistic. 90% of women who are currently imprisoned in the United States were previously victims of violence. 90%. So that could be sexual assault, child molestation, child abuse, rape, um, domestic violence. And so if you realize that maybe these women aren't just bad seeds and are criminals because of their own free will, that maybe they committed criminal acts because of the psychological damage of the violence. Maybe they're retaliating against their abuser. Often there's a co-addictive relationship. Maybe if there's an abusive relationship, it's compounded with violence and drug addiction. And so some of the, of course, we have to deal with criminals once they commit criminal acts. We have to keep society safe. But we also need to recognize that a lot of the reasons why people are driven into these kinds of actions are, again, fact you mentioned mental illness, or you mentioned, psychological violence on individuals, and the effects of that kind of experience could be traumatic. The abuse is traumatic. Um, just for example, there was a study done on male prisoners in a Boston prison, and they found that 50% of them had been beaten by their parents, and 40% of them had witnessed someone being killed in front of them. Imagine living in a community where violence is the norm, and 40% of the people saw people killed literally in front of their eyes. That's going to have an effect on you, how you develop, and what kinds of things you need to do to survive. And it's going to affect maybe um, the kind of stress levels that individuals have. And we know that this even affects brain development. People who are raised in low socioeconomic situations have thinner prefrontal cortexes, and we know that stress can induce brain development, can affect brain development in a particular way. And if you're in a high stress environment, either because you are not sure whether you can pay your rent week to week or month to month, or because there's high levels of violence in your community, or whether you're stressed about whether you can make it to school without being attacked, um, that affects brain development, which affects moral development, which affects behavior.
I'm in agreement with you 100%. My example of the criminal shooting someone and then saying, well, he can't just let this person go because of these influences, because it might just open up a whole door of it. I mean, that's just speaking from a judicial standpoint. That's not my personal belief. I believe in all the stress factors, environmental, a situation that could lead a person to do what they do. But then you got to look at the outliers as well, too, the people that make better of their life. You see plenty of celebrities that talk about, I was put in a horrible scenario. You didn't see me turn to drugs. You know what I did? I got my life better and I did this. I mean, they used it in a different method. I think that all these factors play into why people do the things that they do. To criminals, for instance, if you're raised in a horrible, stressful environment, more likely than not, you're going to end up committing some of those acts when you become older, just because you've been around it so much. I'm right next to Baltimore. I could tell you that's the second most dangerous city in the United States. You know, a lot of the situations aren't necessarily the people aren't bad. It's just the environment and people being forced to do things where they feel like this is the only option to get out of the situations that they're in. Now, I can understand that, but if you're talking about you got to keep society safe, like you mentioned, that's how they look at it, is just lock them up. And I don't think that's right at all. I just think that's how they're always going to look at it, because it's a name on a paper. You know, I'm not trying to, I can't fix that. I don't know how to fix that. I don't know where that starts. But I definitely think that that should be something that should be brought to the table in a lot of aspects of this things. I mean, that can't just be to lock them up. It worked. It didn't even work for a while. It just, that's always what the answer was. And I think now you see a lot more with redevelopment of things. I know they say incarceration's a time to think about what you did. No, it's not. It's a time suck. All it does is block off whatever how long they're in prison for, and they come right back out and do the same shit, because you're not fixing a core issue. It's like sending someone to rehab. Are you fixing the problem, or are you just trying to get them off that drug so they turn to another one? You didn't fix the core issue. Fix the core issue.
Yeah, so this is what my newest book is about. Rejecting Retributivism is a kind of attempt to explain how we would revise the criminal justice system in light of this view on free will and these facts about crime and criminal behavior. So on my model, I call it the public health quarantine model, but basically the idea would be something like this: like, think about, let's say I travel to meet you in person, and I take a plane, and I get off at the airport, and they test me, let's say, because we have all these COVID tests and everything, and I test positive for Ebola, right? Um, let's say, we all, I think, would agree the state would be justified in quarantining me, and they would be justified in limiting or restricting my liberty, not because I deserve punishment, not because of free will, not because I am morally responsible, and not for retributive reasons. That is, you would be justified in quarantining me based, in my model, on the right of self-defense and prevention of harm to others, i.e., you would have to quarantine me to prevent a pandemic, right? So what I would argue is that we could give a similar account for incapacitating seriously dangerous criminals, child molesters, serial killers, repeat violent offenders. And the argument would be that we could justify what's called incapacitating them, which is a not punishing per se, but limiting or restricting their liberty. So putting them, isolating them from society. Um, on the grounds of the right of self-defense and prevention of harm to others, analogous to the justification we have for quarantine, without bringing in free will or moral responsibility or just deserts or retribution. You could simply justify it on the grounds of what I call the defensive rights: the right to defend yourself, the right to defend society. Um, Now, that would explain what we could do with criminals, even if we give up the belief in free will. But I also want to say that we have to give up this myopic obsession with punishment, as you say. We have a mass incarceration problem in the United States, and it isn't making us safer. It's not reducing crime. We've been trying the tough on crime approach for decades, and it's not helping. We have 4.5% of the world's population, but the United States houses 25% of the world's prisoners. That's the largest rate of incarceration known to civilization. No other society in the history of mankind has ever incarcerated that many people. We roughly imprison 700 people for every 100,000 people. Compare that to Norway, Denmark, Sweden. They're at like 6 to 10 people for every 100,000.
Well,
Um,
can I ask what the
60 to 70 people for
can
every
I ask
100.
what the logical answer would be? Because I know a lot of people that stick with the belief that we have an incarceration problem also say that we should just let people out or do something of that sort. And we saw that happen with the guy who ran over a bunch of people in his minivan during that parade. That dude was caught he was arrested for trying to run over his girlfriend with his car. And they let him out because of COVID. And then he ran over a bunch of people. Like he was in, so I think it needs to be checked on both sides here. Like you can't just incarcerate people and you can't just let everybody out. You need to do a thorough look through. You need to rechange the whole system. You can't just look to that being your only answer is incarcerating people. And the fix isn't just to let everybody back out because there's wrongfully imprisoned people, I think, that need to be out as well, too. People that are locked up on trumped up drug charges that don't make any sense or they're pinned to blame or nobody had enough evidence, but they still booked the guy anyway. That's 100% happening. I follow the Innocence Project. It's a horrible scenario these people are placed in. But you need to just have a whole kind of there needs to be more time put into this shit. And it's not just the criminal system, it's everything in the world. I understand there's a giant time consumption in people right now, and it's crazy. The one thing I wanted to do was make a show where I had to get an hour of someone's time to be able to talk because a lot of people don't feel like they have that. A lot of people feel like they can only give me 30 minutes. But that's the thing is that it's the time consumption that society has somehow pressed into our brains, brainwashed us to think that we're never going to have enough time or never going to be able to get done or do the things. And that is a factor of society. For instance, I don't post on social media. I do one post a day. That's it. Now, if you're doing a show, you're out of the fucking game. And that's with anything that happens to do with the eyes of the public. You need to be doing a podcast 1 hour, a TV show the next, a broadcasting thing the next time, an Oscar ceremony, and then like 50 other things. And then you can go to sleep and only for 20 minutes. And then you got to get up and get going again. That's just how society is fast paced and fast tracked to do a large amount of people in a short amount of time. And that is the worst way to run something. And I would think that you would have more people, more understanding, and more compassion if you had more people in just giving time to the things that they feel like they don't have time for. And I don't know how that gets fixed. I think that's the crucial element in all these discussions because honestly, I don't side with the left or the right political or any of that stuff. They all have really good points, but you got to have the time to sit there and hear them out because this is where conversation is one of the most important things. But you don't have those conversations anymore. You have a judge that is working 30 different cases a day, an unlimited amount, basically, or as more, way more than they should. And they're trying to make a just decision off the evidence that's presented in a short amount of time, trying to make sure it doesn't go on forever and waste everybody's time. That's the whole thing, wasting time. If you're pressing someone on a charge and you don't know and you're trying to get the facts straight and you're trying to get the correct answer, most of the time, if you've talked to enough people, you can look at them. And I know people say this is like a fringe theory, whatever you want to say. You can tell when someone's bullshitting you or when you're not giving the evidence, or at least I can. I don't know if most people can. I've done 1,000 of these shows. I've picked it up by now if someone's feeding me a story. But a judge should be able to do that. A judge should be able to tell that. Those are people that should be appointed in these high positions to do these cases. Now, they do have a lot of cases on their hands, and I get that. There's a limited amount of judges, or however you want to say, and they have a certain amount of cases per trial. But they rush through them on the basis of get to the point, get to the point, get to the point. I get the whole like rounding it up. You're feeding me a story, rambling, whatever, but it doesn't do it a big service when you're talking about someone's life that's going away, and it could be on a wrong thing. I have empathy for that, but also a factor of there's a lot of stuff where like prisons will let people out on the basis of riots, societal views and stuff as well too that play a factor. I mean, you could shoot someone with a gun who's trying to rob your house or something, and you can be arrested for shooting that person that was breaking into your house in some states. So I mean, it's really really strange how everything goes on, and I'm not saying and I'm not trying to give a blanket template for everything, but I think you have to talk about all these types of issues, everything, even the hypotheticals, like what people would console that's conspiracy talk. Throw that in there too. You need to have all these brains of thinking at one seat so you can sit here and see every perspective because you're not, it's a bunch of yes men at a table and it's getting old, man. It's getting old.
Yeah, I mean, so there are a number of things I would say. I mean, first of all, I think there are people who dedicate their time to this. I've written a lot. There's lots of people working on criminal justice reform. One of the things I would suggest, in it's implicit in what you're saying, is we need to sit down with people from all different political perspectives on this, but we also need to have evidence-based approaches. We need to literally look at what works and what doesn't work. And the other aspect I would say, in terms of the time constraint issue, is that's a huge problem in the criminal justice system, because a vast majority of people never actually stand before a judge, never actually have a trial, never actually have the facts looked at. Nearly 90% of all cases are settled in plea bargaining. And plea bargaining is a way to deal with the mass amount of people that are being processed through the criminal justice system every year. I think in one year, maybe it was last year or the year before, more than 5 million people were arrested. And you have to process that many people through the criminal justice system. Many of them plea out because of economic reasons. Many of them plea out because they don't have money for good representation. Many of them plea out because they're afraid that they might end up with a worse outcome if they try to roll their dice and take it to court, or take it to trial, I should say. And so, one of the things we could do to try to alleviate some of that pressure and some of that time is actually look at what kinds of things we're criminalizing. I mean, so we've criminalized so many things within our society, that, and many of them have nothing to do with violence or nonviolent offenses. Things like, I would favor criminalizing drug possession, or decriminalize drugs. Partly because I think many of the people who have addiction issues would be better served with drug treatment than incarceration. And we also have many cases where people are being, you know, entering into the criminal justice system for nonviolent possession causes, and those things would be better served by alternative methods, I think. There are other aspects that we criminalize, sort of broken window policies where we over police certain types of infractions, and these are usually infractions that we essentially implement for to keep society clean, and for purposes of like New York City engaged in these broken window policies. If you think of the George Floyd case, for example, the guy in New York who was strangled by the police officer, and the one who's repeatedly said, "I can't breathe," and was
I
ultimately
watched
killed.
all 3 weeks or whatever of that trial. I gotcha.
Yeah, but the think about the initial infraction that triggered the whole episode. The police officer essentially approached him, and the exchange took place because he was selling what are called loosies. It's illegal to sell single cigarettes in New York, right? So you can't break a pack up and sell them as single cigarettes. It's a crime. And so that was the initial impetus for the police to approach him. And then we see that interaction led to the death of an individual, right? Um, well, maybe these are kind of infractions that don't need to be criminalized. Maybe we should rethink the kinds of things that we criminalize. When you look at the United States, for example, 1 out of every 31 Americans is somewhere in the criminal justice system. Think about that. 1 out of every 31 Americans. That means probation, parole, jail, prison, somewhere in that net is 1 out of every 31 individuals in the United States. That we just have a highly punitive society. Maybe our criminal justice system needs to be relooked at in terms of what we want to protect society from. Maybe we need to think about all the kind of nonviolent offenders, whether they're alternatives. Like, for example, many of the people incarcerated in the United States, in fact, the vast majority, are over 50%, some estimates 60% for women, some statistics in 70% range, are suffering from diagnosable mental illnesses. Our our prisons have become de facto mental health institutions. They're not suited for that. And they're not helping individuals in any way. Many of those people would be better served with mental health services rather than being brought into this context of prisons, which often exasperates their mental illnesses. And then, as you pointed out, we release them and expect them to be model citizens, where we didn't provide them with any methods of rehabilitation and reintegration. And so our recidivism rates, our repeat crime rates are some of the worst in the world. 76.6% of prisoners will be rearrested within the first 5 years of release. And that's because we cage them, we dehumanize them, we don't give them any kind of services, we don't provide them with any educational opportunities or work training or skill building. And then we release them and say, okay, now be perfect citizens, where they've acquired kind of learned helplessness. Every aspect of their life has been controlled. They've had no autonomy for many years, and they have no skill set that will allow them to survive. And oh, yeah, then on top of that, we disenfranchise them by saying you can't get public housing because you have a felony conviction, and this pushes them to the borders of homelessness and additional crime.
I think as much as we talk about like reforming criminal people as well too, I think you should do the same with cops. I think there needs to be a thorough look through, but sadly, I know so many cops they're like we're always hiring, we're always looking for someone. I don't necessarily think that's the answer. I mean, there was a large thing with it's joining the military, that type of thing. Well, that also affected cops as well too. They got a large amount of people in a short amount of time, and necessarily that might not have been the proper choice because there was a not a very good look through. If you want to talk about an easy fix to a lot of this, I think a lot of this boils down to the media as well too. Some of the best cops I know I work at a gym, so I see them come in all the time. They don't have any social media apps. They don't have Facebook. Their department does not let them have Facebook, Instagram, anything like that. They just stay off the media. They don't watch the news. They don't want to be up on it. They don't want to see any of that. And they are the nicest people. And it's not a race thing. They will take their time with whoever. They don't care because they're not mentally disturbed from what they see from the media. And I think that boils down to there needs to be a small implementations like that, or you implement no using your social media, no using don't even have an account. I don't care. If you work for the force, don't do it because I think that plays a lot into your head. It's why people are so jumpy on the gun. That's why and it's on both sides. I feel like the whole social societal structure needs to be taken away from media for a sense because they're getting really distorted perspectives of what things are. There's a lot of people, and we can sit here and talk about like Will Smith at the Oscars, whatever. That whole reaction, how everyone is hating Will Smith right now, that could have been the other way if that would have taken off first. But more people sided with Chris Rock, and that's how society has went. Even Chris Rock said he wasn't going to write jokes until he sees how society goes with this, because he doesn't know it can change rapidly, all in an instant. Everyone could have been on the side of Will Smith, but instead, everyone was on the side of Chris Rock. But most people in the beginning said he was defending his wife. But now people are like, no, he's a piece of trash. It's the way the society goes, and it distorts the media, and then the media distorts people. It's a back and forth biting combo. I think that's a start. I bet you would have a lot more people that wouldn't be jumpy on the gun if they were doing a position like that, or the recent shooting that just happened, or the recent video that was leaked about that as well too. There's so much where I just feel like everyone's ramped up to level 10 or 11 and everyone's got views and I'm pretty sure everyone's got comments, even people listening to this. But I'm just saying the easiest thing you can do is why the hell are you on 10? Like back it down to one. And I think that's a lot from what we see, a lot of what we take in. I just think we're subconsciously taking in so much that we don't realize we're doing it. Like me and you know, we're taking in what we're saying, me and you. But subconsciously, are we taking in other factors like what we saw this morning, what we saw, whatever? It's just those types of things that stay into our heads. Like for instance, the light bouncing from my camera or from my computer hitting my eyes. It's being absorbed into my eyes, and a small bit of that light is being it's staying in here just for a short amount of time, a little couple seconds afterwards. But that's a factor. Now think of that with your phone. Think of that with the stuff that you see. Imagine if you see a kid get hit by a car in the morning. You think that person's going to be okay the rest of the day? Probably not. Like these are factors when you see on your device. Now it might be at a smaller scale because you're not actually seeing it happen in real time. You might be seeing a video, but they play into a part of your subconscious. And I think this needs to be a whole aspect that needs to be looked at as well too. Guaranteed you, if you turn like when Facebook and Twitter and all that shit's down, look for like positive stuff that trends. Does that ever happen? Not necessarily like when it's someone's birthday, but more likely what's trending is a death, things that go on the Ukraine, all these types of things where people go, why do people have input in a subject they're not involved in? It's because it's right in your face and it gets on everybody's mind. You know, the best example I could give you is when you walk into a conversation, like any of the conversations I do, whenever a topic goes necessarily in a different direction than the thing they were initially going to talk about, is probably because that person was thinking about it before the conversation started. And that means it's because it's absorbed into your head. It's what you're thinking about. And naturally, through conversation, you're going to bring it out. It's happened in so many of my episodes before. It's not my fault, but people listening to it be like, "Why the hell didn't you talk about this?" That's the thing. You're absorbing too much. You're absorbing way too much, and it gets people ramped up. And I bet you, if you just cut that off a little bit, you're going to see a de-escalation. I've been cutting off social media. It's the biggest freeing thing out there. I don't feel ramped up about politics anymore. I don't feel ramped up about any of this. These are factors I bet you'll see a giant societal change if people just took a step back from. Now, I'm not trying to sing you like this is the cure for everything, but it helps. And I think it's these factors that play into a lot of things as well too. I bet if you're a teacher and you're teaching your students, do an experiment. Show them, like I did a social experiment probably like 5, 6 months ago. I'm not a PhD person. I'm not at all. But I did this social experiment where I would send somebody a message knowing they weren't going to like this type of message. So they were going to do one of three things. One, they would see the message and ignore me. Two, they would be like, "What the hell, Rob?" Three, they would just literally be like, "Okay," or something where the conversation would just end because they didn't want to go into it. I did it to 15 people without telling them what I was doing, and they all of them hit one of those three. And it just shows you that people don't want to end up engaging in a conversation about things. They either want to argue, they want to shut off, or they just want to ignore you because they still want to be friends with you. That's the thing, is like we don't have conversation anymore because everyone's so ramped up. So take the media away, what do you get? Do you have more people making decisions on the basis of things they want to do? That word freedom, for instance, it's supposed to mean like happiness in a sense. It's like the essence of being happy. You're free. Are you? Are you happy? Because if we say all the people that have free will or think they have free will, for instance, how many people are fucking miserable, man? Like, that's a real question. Like, I don't know if I'm way off topic here. Maybe I'm just in my thoughts about shit, but it's a true thing when we talk about all these factors that play, and everybody's got a perspective in on something. The best thing you can do is just talk and have that conversation, engage, let people say what they have to say. You say some stuff back. Don't argue. It boils down to nothingness. That's the society that needs the small steps to change right there. I mean, at least in my perspective, but also, I don't know. I had frosted flakes this morning too. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that these, social media has compounded these echo chambers. And if you look at over politicization and, political divide in this country, it's probably as bad as it's ever been. And yeah, I think, a lot of it has to do with our modern lives and how we process information. Philosophers by their very nature are open for conversation. I mean, we're sort of trained. I mean, not to say that we're all good at it, and philosophers are people, and they make bad arguments and good arguments, and get argumentative in the bad sense. But we're trained to, sort of be open to looking at different perspectives, engaging in a kind of Socratic conversation about stuff, in the hopes of actually achieving something. And that's, so I agree with, that aspect of it. It's something I've, been trained to do by disposition. That's how I am. Um, that said, I think, like you gave the example of police officers not being on social media, okay, that's great, but there's probably the reason is also largely that the police departments are concerned with perception and fearful of the political views of police officers being taken out of context or being highlighted or being used against the police department. So it's probably, it's probably for those purposes more than any. And those individuals will still be surrounded by people. They're still going to be influenced by the community. Now, their community may not be a social media community. It's going to be the community of family and friends and fellow police officers. So, in terms of the bigger question about free will, I don't know if anyone could ever be an island unto themselves, right? No one is purely, um, you know, uh, uh, acontextualized to the point where they're not influenced by other factors, by factors of peer groups and zeitgeist and the kind of thinking that one sort of falls victim to, partly because of who they surround themselves by. I do think, on a kind of political level, on a societal level, we have to surround ourselves with people who have different views. We have to make sure that we go out of our way, and I'm with you. I don't argue on social media. I tend not to engage in political debates on social media. You never get, it doesn't convince anyone. It's all virtue signaling. It's not for the purpose of real authentic conversation. It's not even the context that's looking for real conversation, right? I mean, the dynamics of Twitter and everything else is in many ways one directional, right? It's to kind of get something out, not to get information or feedback in return, in a certain way. So I do think these things have affected our individual relationships, but I don't know if they fundamentally change who we are in terms of whether or not agents are self-made, or whether or not they have kind of freedoms that the metaphysical freedom that would be important in the sense that I'm talking about. But
I mean, that's the thing is like real conversation. What's that? I don't even think this is real I mean, it's good conversation. It's conversation I feel like I'm in, but at the same time, it's like it's going to be a podcast episode. It's so hard to forget that as well too. Like a lot of times I forget, and I try and make sure that my guest feels comfortable to forget that as well too when they're in here. So it's just me and you talking, because right now, I mean, I could just choose not to post it and it doesn't go up, but I'm going to. But it's that factor of the real part to it, but there's all these counter influences that play into your head. Like if I say it like this, or if it's phrased like this, how is someone going to perceive this, or how is someone going to perceive that? I just think you spend way too much time overthinking about things. I think people lost the factor of being able to understand what someone means. You know what I mean? Like you'll see a lot more people attacking rather than people defending. Like it's not necessarily that you said something wrong, but I've heard so many comedians get jokes taken out of context where it was like, that's not what they meant though. Like that's not at all what they meant. And if you knew that person, you knew that's what they meant. But people want to jump on the smoking gun. Like people want to go right towards it and be like, this is it 100%. And I feel like I don't know where that came from in society. I don't know where that kind of like, maybe it was like trying to get the megaphone from the person who has the megaphone. But I think that's a corrupting aspect of a lot of things too, which I kind of link back into social media. But I also think it's politics have a fucking hand in everything. I hate to say it like that, but it does. It's like everything that you could really honestly, any topic, any research study, any of that type of stuff. A lot of people say, I don't want to boil it down to politics, but it's like that's what it always leads to. It's like every influence decision that you make is now boiled down to this one subject. I mean, half the time someone won't even introduce themselves. They'll just introduce their political party and decide what you are and then decide if they want to talk with you. Like that's nuts to me.
yeah, I mean, we do lead with politics and our political identities now. I mean, I have a friend, Rob Talese, who works on these issues, and maybe you should have him on as a guest.
Send them
He
my
has
way.
yeah, he has a couple of books, and one of the more recent ones was actually called "Overdoing Democracy." And sort of the idea of this is that we've kind of politicized every aspect of our lives. Like, you can tell me where you shop, what kind of car you drive, where you buy your clothes, and I know your politics, right? Like, we've politicized everything. Like if you shop at Whole Foods, I know you're left. If you go to Walmart, or you buy, your fast food is Chick-fil-A. I know your politics. And this is true actually of every aspect of our lives. We politicize the companies we support. We politicize, where we purchase our goods from. And every aspect of our lives has now been to divide ourselves further and further into certain types of camps. Um, and generally, you tell me you drive a Prius or a Subaru. I know what kind of person you are,
I
and it's
just look
gotten
at them and I know. I
yeah.
could easily tell by someone's face what
But
I
this is
feel like
not
politics forms your face. It
yeah.
does.
So this is not a good thing. And so one of the things he talks about with overdoing democracy is that we need to have more depoliticized context in which we engage with our fellow. So, like, one of the things I've noticed as a parent is, when you have to get together for school district reasons, you have to get together for, parent teacher association, or to help organize the play. And in that context, I don't know what my fellow parents, what their politics are. Um, and I don't care. And it becomes a more human environment for us to interact, right? Because in this case, we have a shared enterprise, right? And I could judge you as a person. I don't have to judge you based on your politics. I judge you based on, are you contributing to help organize this event for our kids? Are you there? Are you supportive? And those are the kinds of things that could create friendships. And then you may realize later, oh, we have different political opinions. But in social media, in other areas of our lives, we kind of lead with our political identities. And it's hard, the COVID thing was the most extreme example, because it was divided by mask wearers and non-mask wearers, and vaxxers and non-vaxxers. And so that you walk into the store, I know what you're thinking, and I know what kind of politics and political identity you have. And that was literally on your face, right? Like, you literally are seeing someone and can visually tell what your political identity is, without any kind of conversation at all. And that prevents us from having conversations and dialogue with people who don't have the same opinions as us. So I think we need to figure out ways to organize our societies and our communities and our exchanges with the individuals to create these environments that are devoid of that political aspect of our lives. And it's focused more on shared other communal goals, like, the children, or, cleaning the park, or whatever it is that brings you together for a particular reason. Those reasons could be enough to get you to a point where you could have those conversations that could get you to have, create personal bonds with individuals, outside of the context of our politics. And it probably was true in the past, where we just didn't know what the politics of our neighbors were, and our relationships were probably better for it. But that's not the world we live in, and so we have to create these contexts again, I think, to kind of de-escalate the situation.
Do you think more people are willing to talk with people of their political side rather than talk to people against?
Well, I think the evidence suggests that's true. I mean, we look for self confirmation. Confirmation bias is just a human tendency. You want to hear things that affirm our own beliefs, and so we tend to surround ourselves with people with like beliefs and like identities. And again, to point to some of the work my friends have done, one of the things that happens is it actually there's this really weird escalation that happens even within your bubble, where you essentially become more and more polarized, because you become the most extreme version of that group the more you're around like-minded people. And so there was an example, I think, where in Rob Talise's book, where he talks about a group of people in Denver getting together and talking about the altitude of Denver. And literally, the longer they were together, the higher they kept on believing the altitude of the city was. And it's partly because you're already in a group that's leaning toward the left or the right,
You're
and then you have
reinforcing
to,
it.
and you're reinforcing it, and then you have to become somehow, um, you have to somehow identify the identity of the group, and gain further kind of credence within that group, and you end up becoming more and more politicized over time. So the fact that we're in these political bubbles not only isolates us from people on the other side, it actually makes us more radical versions of ourselves.
Yeah, I always wondered, because when I say the word talking, or talking with people of the same political side rather than the people that you're against, that only depends on what your definition of talking would be, is if you're talking to the positive or negative. Because then if we talk about people that are more willing to talk to the other side because they just want to have an argument. But I feel like that comes from being around so many people with the same ideas as you, that it reinforces your belief that this is 100% true. Like, for instance, for my show, I've had people who have testified against Anthony Fauci, and then people who have testified with Anthony Fauci. So I'll get attacked from whoever that person shares the episode. Like, I had Peter McCullough on, Dr. Pierre Corey. Then I've had a couple of people that have been on Fauci's side. Um, it, I don't have a bias in any of this. I just kind of am trying to talk to everybody and make it an even playing field. Like if you talk to one side, it means if I talk to a flat earther, I got to talk to a NASA scientist. They'll tell you it's not. Just because you need to have that even playing field. But if that person shares an episode, they're getting that person's side that listens to it and they condemn you as such. And I just feel like there's not really that kind of level playing field. And it's not easy to do. It's not easy to, because when you are surrounded by something so much and you care about something so much, which is like the environment thing, for instance. I had one person on about solar energy or nuclear energy, and then I had to reach out to a bunch of people about uh solar, hydro, every single one. Nobody has an answer. They're all just like, my idea is the best. It's like, well, don't sales pitch me. Just tell me why it is. And then we can go from there and we can talk about the types of things. But everyone's got like a small piece to the puzzle. And it's like your puzzle piece becomes the whole puzzle when all you hear is that puzzle piece. And it's like, it's kind of not revolutionary. It's just kind of enlightening in a sense when you start realizing like everyone's working towards the same goal, but like they're doing it in the most like polar opposite like directions, I would say. You know what I mean? It's like your guys are trying to get to Z, you guys are both at A, but instead you want to do two at a time and one back, and the other person just wants to go one forward. You know what I mean? Like it's that you're gonna get there at the same pace, but you guys are just working in two conflicting forces. Um, I don't know how that gets fixed. I don't think that'll ever be fixed, man. That's our doom right there. Like there's these ideas of a utopia that AI and all this type of stuff is going to lead us to this utopia. I'm like, is that freedom? Is that being uh do what like people like if I had no job, I'd do whatever I want. Would you be happy? That's like a deep question right there. Cause I was like, I don't think I'd be happy without a job. I need a job. And people go, no, you're brainwashed to think you need a job. I'm like, you might be right. But I just feel like I would be you sit at home, do nothing. It's cool for 2 weeks, dude. But then like you're done, dude. You're just like, I want to go back to work. I need to get out of the house. I feel like crap. And it's just because you're sitting around doing nothing. Like people feel like they don't have enough time, like we said, or I said before. People feel like they don't have enough time. But then when they're given unlimited amount of time, they wish they had less. What is that?
Well, I think, yeah, well, I think, yeah, people need some source of meaning in their lives, and for some, that could be a kind of work. I mean, one of the things I often think is that even if I didn't get paid to do what I would do, I'd still do it because it's just something I find enjoyment in. So if I'm not philosophizing in a classroom, I'd still be talking to someone in a bar about philosophical issues or writing about philosophy just because at this point in my life, it's who I am, it's how I think, it's what I do. And, you know, I wouldn't, there's not going to be a point. I think that I'll ever retire in a sense of never continue to do this. I'll do it as long as I can because it is essentially something that is part of me and brings me meaning. So yeah, I mean, if people didn't work, I think that it would be a question of what we do with ourselves otherwise. And I think that there are plenty of other sources of meaning in life that one could find. It doesn't have to be part of this capitalist cog in the wheel kind of work. It could be a kind of work that just brings you fulfillment.
I just have one last question and we can wrap it up. But do you see this like idea or this topic of more people leaning towards like what is free will or questioning oneself, I would say, with just the rising trend of a lot of people suffering from what I would call an identity crisis? Like it seems like a lot of people now are just questioning what's their purpose. Like what are they like for me, for instance, I question that every single day. Like what's my purpose in life? What am I supposed to be doing? Am I on the right track? All these types of things. And I don't know if that's a societal kind of influence in a sense, or if it's just a I know I keep seeing you trying to fix it. It's okay. But it's with a social identity, I would say that I think identifies a lot of how people feel like they are perceived and who they are. But I feel like a lot of people are also suffering from a huge identity crisis, not
Well,
being able to
yeah.
find oneself.
So I think there are many sources for these identity crises. I have a book with Owen Flanagan called Neuroexistentialism, which is based on the idea of existentialism, but a new source of this existentialism. And one of the things you think of as existentialisms are ruptures in our sense of meaning or morals or purpose. And there have been historically different causes for it. I mean, first wave existentialism was Nietzsche and kind of the death of God kind of concern that, if there's no God, there's no meaning. And then you had a kind of existentialism that came with World War II, where you thought humanism would bring us peace and prosperity and eternal progress. And then you get Pol Pot and Hitler, and you're like, well, that didn't quite work. And now we have different sources of existential angst. Some of them come from neuroscience. That's what our book was about. You know, maybe developments in the brain sciences are telling us that we're not the kind of beings we think we are. That life ends when the brain ceases to function. That um, maybe we lack the kind of free will we think we have. And these are new sources of anxiety. But I think technology is a big source of anxiety in people's lives now. And I think COVID just put many people over the top and caused them to reevaluate their purpose, what they were doing, why they were doing it. I think we're having a kind of confluence of events in our lives, and one of them is the source of technology. One of them is developments in science. Others are aspects of just happenings in the world, like the pandemic. And these are causing disruptions in our kind of conception of ourselves, but also why, where our place is and what we ultimately find meaningful. The free will issue for me, though, is that I think people can find meaning in a world even if they lack free will. And so part of what I've argued is for a positive view of free will skepticism. I'm an optimistic skeptic. So not only do I believe we lack free will, I think we're actually better off giving up the belief in free will. Because as we, abandon the belief in free will, and with it, this notion of just desserts and retributive punishment, we could look more clearly and more deeply into the causes and systems that shape individuals and their behavior. And this will allow us to adopt more humane, more effective practices and policies. So for me, I think it also could eradicate a kind of corrosive moral anger. And this has come up several times in our conversation, the kind of moral anger we exhibit toward people of different political opinions, the kind of moral anger we find on the internet and outrage, which is at a fevered pitch. And part of it all really comes and is tied to this belief in free will. Maybe viewing individuals in the context that I'm proposing could actually eradicate this sort of type of corrosive moral anger, could be beneficial to our interpersonal relationships. We could more humanize individuals. And instead of blaming them or being angry at them for having the political views that they have, we could begin to understand how they acquired those beliefs and why they have those beliefs. Maybe begin to kind of be more humble about our own beliefs. And these things could be more beneficial for society rather than the kind of cancel culture, the kind of retributive reactions, the things we don't approve of, the kind of moral anger we see that's all pervasive in the political realm. Is just not good for society and is really taking us to the verges of destroying the fabric of our democracy. So there's all kinds of different ways we could approach it, but really looking at the moral psychology and why people have this kind of psychology and how it ties into aspects of our agency and aspects that shape us as individuals, I think could begin to free us from some of these more corrosive features.
Well, Greg, it's been a pleasure chatting with you, man. Is there a place where people can find any of your links? Do you have a website, social media? I follow you on Twitter.
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter. I think it's at Gregg D Caruso, but also I have a website, just my name. It's www.greggcaruso.com.
And I'll link it all in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.